Welcome, everyone. This is Weekends with Kasparian and Michael Brooks. This is our very first episode. I'm very excited to be here with you. Hey, Michael.
It's great to be with you, Anna. We're here, the debut. We've arrived. This has been a long time coming.
I know. You and I have been wanting to do a project together, a show together forever. And so I'm glad that Jacobin provided a platform to do this. And this show is going to be different from what you and I do with our own shows outside of Jacobin. You and I have a lot of really great conversations, lengthy discussions about, power structures in this country, the direction we want the left to go in, the way we think we can win. And I think that it's important to share those conversations, especially strategic conversations, with a broader audience.
Definitely. And I have to say, I was surprised. I mean, I've worked with Jacobin on, various things and published articles, and obviously have had Bhaskar and many great Jacobin authors on my show and the Majority Report, like Connor Kilpatrick. But when they came out and reached out to me and they said that they wanted us to do a Dave Rubin dunking show for the Jacobin YouTube channel, I was surprised because I do associate Jacobin with a little bit of a different brand. And they said, hey, can you guys just play Dave Rubin clips on a weekly basis and do the Rube review? I was shocked, but here we are.
Well, I'm sure that there will be plenty of opportunities to dunk on our good friend Dave Rubin. So just to give you guys a quick overview of the show, especially today's show, we are going to have a great guest today. The speechwriter and senior advisor for the Bernie Sanders campaign, David Sirota, will be joining us, and we're going to talk to him about, what we should expect next. What we've learned from the Sanders campaign in 2020, how it differs from 2016. But, it's not all vegetables. We're also going to have the fun segments where we dunk on people who say incredibly stupid things. Meghan McCain will make an appearance today. So we'll talk about some of her recent comments about Bernie supporters. And it's just a good mix of important discussions and some fun.
Definitely. And we want to build out that strategic insight. We hope that this show is part of an effort in its own small way, but hopefully effective way of bridging out, reaching new audiences, taking ideas and policies and even bigger visions and putting them out as best we can to a bigger audience, more people. And that's going to be a lot of what this show is about too. How do we actually talk with small business people, as an example, about why socialism might actually be really helpful for them? We want to do something that is going to really work as almost like an antenna, right? Like we and sometimes good ideas and really important things are like ahead of the mass culture. But if they don't come back and sort of reach into the mainstream, then they're not going to get anywhere. And we really want to, I think that's part of the kind of strategic mission of the show, in addition to us having a lot of fun and doing this show that, Anna, not only have we really wanted to do this, mm-hmm. A lot of people have been asking for this show.
A lot of people. They wanted a strong leftist show, the strongest leftist show. So, yeah, definitely. And okay,
Jacobin saw the Twitter comments and they said, we're looking at it very strongly.
Okay, so I think it's also kind of fun to share with the audience, how we got to know each other, because Dave Rubin is actually a big part of that, for me at least. I knew of you and the work that you do. I always loved, your contributions to the Majority Report. I love that you branched off and started TMBS. But honestly, anytime I saw you in a video dunking on Dave Rubin, I would watch it. And finally, we start, communicating back and forth, having fun. And I'm not afraid to admit it. I came for the dessert, but I think that your content slowly but surely I don't know. So people say radicalized me. I don't know if that's really the right terminology I would use, but you definitely opened up a new world for me, politically speaking, and made me question some of my preconceived notions about what can and can't work in our current country, like in our situation, how things are set up. I always thought, no, these ideas too far left. There's no way that we can accomplish them. But when you look at public opinion, when you look at what people desperately need just to survive, it's not even a question of whether or not we can accomplish them. It's a question of when we can accomplish them because we need to. It's
100%.
it's literally dependent for our survival. Our survival is dependent on it. So we need to decommodify things that people need to survive. And healthcare is a perfect example of that. But we'll have those conversations at length throughout this show.
I just want to say, too, that I feel like for me, even though you are obviously and are like at a different, absolutely just in terms of fellowship and experience and so on, there was a huge amount to learn from you and watch. And at the same time, I felt like even though in very different ways, we were both on some similar trajectories. Like my politics have definitely changed over the last several years. In some ways, it's kind of like actually for me, it's sort of like a coming home. My politics was pretty influenced by some Marxist stuff very early on, but also really asking the same kinds of questions. And I think also both wanting to be people that, recognize the total privilege of being able to do this work. And it's super fun and it's unique. It has its burdens, it has its parts that suck too. But, it's not fucking shoveling snow. It's not, there's infinite amount of much harder and obviously more necessary jobs out there. But also that the part about this that is important is I actually think, well, on one hand, I think actually entertaining people is actually really important because life is hard. And you got to have, that's super important. So sometimes when people come up and they say, hey, like that made me laugh. It was like the most relaxed I've been in a while or whatever. That's in some ways the best feedback. And then on the other side of it, to the extent it is possible to be like, hey, we don't want to just be part of a small echo chamber, which mostly we are right now. But we have the capacity to build that out. And I know that you and I are really synchronized on that mission of what can we actually do to make this stuff real. And I think that has always been at the center of our discussions, at the center of our friendship, at the center of our missions, at the center of all the collaborations we've already done, and definitely at the center of this show. And of course, also it's a great opportunity to explore ideas.
Definitely. I love ideas. Yeah, we're all about ideas here.
We're all about ideas. I just want to let everybody know too that I needed to shave because they used like a photo of me from 6 years ago, so I needed to show that I still looked like that.
So it's amazing because I remember like when we were shown that graphic, I thought it looked great. I'm like, it's awesome. And you raised some concern over that photo of you. I'm like, No one's even going to care. You look great. It's not, I didn't say anything, but that's what I was thinking. And then I was shocked to learn that people definitely noticed that it's an older photo, but you do look like that.
Yeah. See, proof.
Yeah. Awesome.
So I think now we're going to get to, and guys, this is an experiment in motion, but now we're going to get to our commentaries.
Yes.
And Anna, you are going first.
All right, let's do it. So I really wanted to address a topic that's been weighing on me for quite some time now, and it has to do with what I believe are credible sexual assault allegations against the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. Now, one of his former staffers, Tara Reid, came forward and basically detailed in great detail the alleged sexual assault that she experienced when she was a staffer, including, and I want to just warn anyone, give you guys a warning if you're uncomfortable with these types of topics. This is going to be detailed about the sexual assault that she allegedly experienced. But she claimed that at one point he pushed her up against a wall, put his hand up her skirt, and penetrated her with his fingers. Now, this is a very serious charge. And there are three main issues that I want to bring up, because it's not just about the seriousness of the charge. It's also about how it's being handled by Biden supporters, by the corporate press, and how this is a massive vulnerability for Joe Biden if the only thing the Democratic establishment cares about is replacing Donald Trump. So first, I just want to note that Democratic voters such as myself are in an unbelievably difficult position right now, because we fully understand and grasp the importance of getting Trump out of office. I want Trump out of office. I said it clearly during the primaries that I will support the Democratic nominee. But now I'm in this unwinnable situation where I'm faced with two options. One option is Donald Trump, who has his own sexual assault allegations and rape allegations against him. And then you have Joe Biden, who is not my favorite by a long shot when it comes to his policy proposals. But now there's this added layer of sexual assault. And I have to question whether or not I'm comfortable casting a vote for anyone who's been accused of sexual assault and has refused to even address it. And that's one of the biggest issues with Joe Biden. Not only are these allegations credible, not only are they detailed, but the Biden campaign released a very broad statement denying any sexual assault, did not address Tara Reade specifically, and Biden himself hasn't released a statement. And I think that that's wrong morally. And I think it's wrong if all you care about is politics and ensuring that we get Donald Trump out of office. Now, why do I think it's important to get Trump out of office? I mean, do I really need to list all the reasons? I mean, it's his brutal behavior, which has claimed the lives of literally dozens of immigrants at the border. These are immigrants who are fleeing violence from their own countries. These are people who needed help, and Trump has decided to treat them like criminals, and literally dozens of innocent asylum seekers have died in cages that he's put them in at the border. Many of them were also children. There's also the fact that he's dismantled the small amount of progress we made with environmental protections. There's the fact that he has packed the courts with conservative judges who will fundamentally impact our lives for decades to come. And again, he himself is someone who's been accused of sexual assault and rape. But again, how do we live with ourselves? How do I, as a woman, live with myself if I end up voting for the other option, who also has this serious sexual assault allegation against him, which is why I want Biden to address it and stop trying to bury it, because this is not something that's just going to go away. This is something that Donald Trump certainly will exploit for his own political advantages as soon as the, debates begin, as soon as the campaigning begins, and as soon as it becomes abundantly clear that the Democratic Party doesn't have an opportunity to replace Biden. Now, why would Trump, who has his own allegations, even go there, right? Any normal candidate wouldn't go there. They wouldn't start picking at their opponent and the allegations against them if they're facing allegations themselves. Except we need to remember that during the 2016 campaign, when all these allegations against Trump had already come out, he had absolutely no problem doing something that was pretty vicious during one of the debates. So I want to just quickly read an excerpt from Nathan Robinson's piece in the Current Affairs. We already know how Trump will play this come debate time. In 2016, after the infamous Access Hollywood tape leaked, Trump responded not with contrition, but by bringing 4 women who had accused Bill Clinton of sexual misconduct: Juanita Broderick, Paula Jones, Kathleen Wiley, and Kathy Shelton as guests to his subsequent debate with Hillary Clinton, where they sat in the audience. So he has no shame. And I think that Trump has avoided even bringing up the sexual assault allegation because he knows that Democrats still have a chance to replace Biden. But once it's clear that Biden's the nominee, you think that Trump's not going to use this against him? Of course he will. So there's the moral question, which I'm dealing with, right? How do I cast a vote for a candidate who refuses to address a serious sexual assault allegation against him? And at the same time, if you don't care about the moral question at all and you only care about electability, how are you going to reconcile this massive vulnerability that Biden's dealing with when it comes to his so-called electability? So that's kind of where I am right now with this election. It's really an unwinnable situation for people like me. And keep in mind that one of the most difficult moments during the Trump presidency for me personally was watching him mock Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who accused Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh of attempted rape. That was such a difficult story that I had to literally walk away from the set, go to the bathroom to just compose myself and come back. And so how do I have that kind of emotional reaction to accusations against Brett Kavanaugh and pretend like it doesn't bother me when it comes to Joe Biden? It does. And we can't be hypocrites who only use cases of sexual assault when it's politically convenient. If we're going to say that we take sexual assault seriously, that needs to apply to everyone, regardless of political ideology, regardless of political outcomes. And I'm just not seeing that right now with the Democratic Party, and it's incredibly disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other really important part of this is also to people to recognize, and I think somebody, Heidi Matthews, is a scholar in Canada, has always had some really interesting and provocative critiques of Me Too, which people should check out. But one specifically with regards to this that I think she saw very early on was the fact that if the sort of like, and this is also the thing that stuck out in Ryan Grimm's original reporting, was literally, you know, the sort of Me Too apparatus in LA blowing off Tara Reid because of the election. And I think that, you know, we see a broader context where there's a whole bunch of questions that need to be answered, need to be explored, need to be looked at. And then the way it's deployed by a liberal political apparatus is, you know, Bernie Sanders says something that I think literally nobody believes he said to Elizabeth Warren, or, you know, if we're being charitable, said like, hey, go for it, run for president. But obviously Donald Trump's going to weaponize anything he could weaponize against anybody. That was like a weeks long news cycle, an attempt to you know, destroy Bernie. And I think that, you know, this is also something where people need to be really clear about the political weaponization and how it will be used by people connected with, you know, basically the Democratic Party apparatus. I mean, after all, look, Anita Dunn, you know, advised Harvey Weinstein, and, you know, Harvey Weinstein is probably still the most like just, you know, just horrifying. And so, you know, there is a through line there.
Yeah, and it's actually pretty incredible because Anita Dunn, you know, who's a longtime Democratic operative, is very much connected to the Time's Up movement, which refused to provide any type of legal help or assistance to Tara Reid. And so one of the other points that I wanted to bring up, and it's a feeling that I've had for a little while now, even before I heard about the accusations against Joe Biden. As a woman, I'm increasingly feeling more and more like a political prop, as opposed to a demographic that has been ignored for a long time when it comes to issues of sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape. The Democratic Party put a foot forward in at least pretending to care about protecting victims of these types of assaults. But I've noticed that that's not really necessarily the case. I've noticed them weaponizing instances or accusations of sexual assault or sexism in the case of Bernie Sanders for their own political advantage. But I certainly don't see them, you know, applying this type of commentary or pressure if it's not politically convenient for them. And so in the case of Joe Biden, it's become abundantly clear to me that they don't think it's politically convenient to bring up and address the seriousness of these allegations that Tara Reid brought forward. But they're also making a huge mistake if they think ignoring it means that it'll go away. It will not go away. Donald Trump is incredibly shameless. He will absolutely bring it up. So that's the electoral component of it, right? But I think it's important for us to stop and think about the moral component of it as well. Who do we want to be as a party? What do we represent? And do we actually care about people who have been victimized, not just women, people in general who have been victimized by sexual predators. If you're not going to apply the same standards to every case, which is certainly the case with people like Alyssa Milano, well, then all you do is hurt any type of progress for sexual assault victims having a voice.
Yeah. And here we are. And also, yeah, and the political mechanization that the way things work, at either levels that are just like defamatory against Sanders, or, even like pop culture figures who are, may have made mistakes, but are frankly accused of, far less, like what Joe Biden was accused of here, and being really clear, like there was always like a thing about Joe Biden is handsy or whatever. This is a totally different ballgame, and folks can see that this is the political application of this stuff from people in the liberal and democratic establishment. It is not about an evolution of culture. It's about a political mechanization, and this makes it really clear. So I agree with you completely, Anna. I want to talk a little bit about escapism, denial, fantasy, and Gramsci. And I'll try to put this together here, and I'm actually going to keep this really short. But I think, guys, we just suffered a really bad loss. It really is a bad thing for the country that Bernie Sanders is not going to be the Democratic nominee. It's a horrible thing for the country that Bernie Sanders is not going to be president. We need to pivot on to other opportunities. Right now, there's probably unprecedented opportunities in general strikes and in labor organizing. But it's also very important to be real with where the left is right now, and what we might figure out how to do to move forward. And I want to talk about two tendencies that I see right now that I think are both unhelpful. So one is this notion of denial. And I think you see this in a lot of folks who, look, I think justifiably, Anna and I are not going to like posture. I live in New York, so I will, enjoy either not checking the mark on the presidential ballot, or, voting for a socialist candidate or whatever. I think if you live in a competitive state, you have to think much more seriously about that. But I also think that a lot of folks are coming forward and basically still essentially telling a story of progress and leftward motion in the Democratic Party, which is true in the margins. It might be true in certain case studies. And yes, of course, there are policies that Democratic Party leaders, some will sort of tip their hats to that they would not have done 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. And yes, we've seen some sort of rhetorical shifts. But actually, the reality is that in the big structural picture, in the big structural valley of the Democratic Party, they have not moved to the left at all, or in any significant structural strategic way. Right now, let's look at the leadership. Joe Biden is the nominee, one of the most right-wing Democrats, the architect of every imaginable bad policy direction for decades on both foreign and domestic policy, and someone who spent most of the campaign, including during the outbreak of the pandemic, railing against the idea of national health care. The Democratic leadership in Congress just helped usher through what I would call a grand theft bailout, an enormous redistribution of resources to the top, and completely unaccountable slush fund, essentially, for Steve Mnuchin and the Trump administration. Andrew Cuomo, who I do think will probably replace Joe Biden, if I'm being honest, is cutting Medicaid right now in the middle of a pandemic outbreaking in New York, which he has completely failed to handle, in spite of his ability to do some decent press conferences. And yes, we can find some examples. Gavin Newsom is a bit more left than he was in the formation of his career and has done a better job in California. But for those who are looking at California as some type of bastion of progressive resistance, remember that this is also the home of Silicon Valley monopolies, still has enormously environmentally problematic ag policies, and a homelessness crisis and a crunch on working and middle class people, and of course the poor across the state. So we need to be real about that in order to respond to it. As a final thing, a Bloomberg firm called Hawkfish, a data vendor and consultancy, which was basically designed and created to serve the Bloomberg campaign, is not going away and hanging its head in shame, as some people think would happen after Bloomberg got humiliated. No, it is actually selling its services or attempting to pitch its services to the Biden campaign, as well as other Democratic and so-called progressive organizations, according to a new report in The Intercept. Then, guys, we also have fantasy. And I want to be a little bit more gentle than I can be sometimes. I think the impulse for revolutionary change is correct. We actually need revolutionary change in this country and globally. As Anna said, this is literally a matter of planetary survival. But at the same time, this push towards the rhetoric of revolution or the escapist fantasy of revolution that we could, and it comes in two ways. One is some people go to examples like 1917 Russia or 1950s in Cuba, and they think of completely different historical times, completely different historical conditions, and project that it would be fun to do something like that here. Now, by the way, I want to make clear, I am not at all opposed to, I want people to be reading about Cuba, Russia, Thomas Sankara, anywhere, just as maybe I want you to actually be reading books about business strategy, okay? Like, I think taking from historical examples and finding inspiration is incredibly generative and incredibly positive. But historically, these are complete non-alignments. Just let's take two really quick examples to illustrate that. As my friend Daniel Bessner pointed out, Stalin, let's be really provocative, during the Russian Revolution was in a position where, as some people know, that they were the revolutionaries carried out petty crimes, or I guess significant crimes like bank robberies and stuff like this in Tsarist Russia. They could go and get jail bids and either escape from jail or get let out of jail, as an example. If somebody in a revolutionary undertaking in 2020 went and tried to rob a bank, they would be killed or spend the rest of their life in maximum security prison with no broader cultural or political dissent from the general population. Julian Assange has been completely railroaded internationally, and he essentially is a news publisher. He's in a prison in the UK that also stores Al-Qaeda operatives. So we need to be real about the unprecedented power of the national security state, but also the cultural buy-in that still exists in the broader population, even as America and capital's elite internationally devastates the world. And I just want people to think of, and I'm going to quote now from a website called War of Position, and Daniel Bessner is also somebody who talks a lot about Gramsci. So, and funnily enough, I'm going to include a quote here from Pete Buttigieg's dad, or Pete Buttigieg's the better Buttigieg. This is quoting now about the difference between war of maneuver, which is about taking on state power physically, and war of position, which has to do with dealing with civil society, dealing with cultural buy-in. That was Gramsci's insight that is a lot more relevant. There wasn't much cultural buy-in to Batista in Cuba. They knew he was a gangster who treated the island as a plaything for the mafia and for the CIA and didn't give a fuck about the general population, right? So there was a war of maneuver, but there wasn't a whole lot of normal day-to-day Cubans who still had some underlying belief in the idea of the Batista state. Whereas there still are, obviously, an enormous amount of Americans that have a belief in the dominant ideas of our culture. And that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. It's not necessarily a good thing. It's just so. And Gramsci's big insight was that in particularly liberal democracies, there was a lot more buy-in on civil society. So I'm just going to quote right now. In modern democracies, direct confrontation, armed uprisings, general strike, etc. I disagree on general strike. I'll put that in because I think conditions are changing with Corona. But I'll just continue to quote. Will not threaten dominant groups so long as their credibility and authority is firmly rooted in civil society. Buttigieg notes, civil society, in other words, is far from being a threat to political society and liberal democracy. It reinforces it. This is the fundamental meaning of hegemony. And this is actually where, if we do our work right, we can help a little bit on the cultural terrain of changing politics. But it also means that the left needs to get back into the center of American life, understand the language of ambition, of small business, of, even as an example, when we talk about really, really important rights issues, also understanding where the broader swath of the country would be, not in terms of in any way compromising on substantive rights, but also recognizing that there will be disagreement on particular controversies, disagreement on how we talk about things, and disagreement between what people think about in the private spheres of their life versus the public spheres of their life. So I would say, guys, we have opportunity. We're in a really serious moment, and we can't deny how bad it is and tell a bedtime story about progress. Some has been made, but a lot hasn't. And we also cannot go into escapism and fantasy.
Yeah, I love that. I have so much to say. I'm going to start off with the fantasy portion of your commentary, because Ben Burgess wrote an excellent essay that I highly recommend everyone read. He has a Patreon page. It's $5 a month, and you get to read his incredible essays. And he talked about, some of the revolution rhetoric that we hear, and the portion of the left that thinks we need an armed revolution. Now, this is I would argue, a small portion of the left. But Ben does a good job in kind of dismantling that argument, because we still have a system in place where we can really garner enough power to change things structurally, right? So we need to think strategically moving forward on how we can mobilize and organize and make that happen. But we need to be, as you often say, precise in our rhetoric, precise in our vocabulary. And we need to think about how our vocabulary could either be inclusive and appealing to a broader group of voters, or the opposite. So I didn't want to buy into this. I didn't want to believe this, but I think at this point it's irrefutably true. Americans do get turned off by the word revolution, because they automatically do think of an armed revolution. They automatically do think of increased instability. And so I didn't want to accept that, but it's just the truth. If you talk to voters on the left who find the policies of Bernie Sanders incredibly appealing, they will tell you, I know, but I don't know. I just don't have the stomach for a revolution right now. I just want normalcy. And so we need to think about our rhetoric and how that has an impact in either helping the candidates we support or hurting the candidates we support. Going back to what you had to say, just about, sure, it's dire about how we haven't fundamentally moved to the left. I actually wanted to buttress that point by giving a few other examples. Just yesterday, Joe Biden extended what's being referred to as an olive branch to Bernie Sanders supporters. And it was a joke. It really was, because his proposal was to lower the Medicare age from 65 to 60. I mean, that's the kind of incremental change that you would expect from Biden without having to appeal to Bernie supporters. And then the second portion of it was, I'm going to go ahead and cancel student loan debt, but it's going to be means tested, and it will not apply to people who went to for-profit colleges, to trade schools, to grad schools. I mean, it just doesn't include so many people who desperately need student loan debt forgiveness. And so the reason why Biden did that, he was empowered to do that, is because he doesn't really see the Bernie camp as powerful. And we need to question why. You see what I'm saying?
100%. I think this is like really, and it's another area that's tricky, because I totally accept that there are people who have, like, when I was like a teenager and like in the beginning of college, I was like definitely part of a lot of like protest movements and like church basement left wing whatever. Okay, so I have some understanding, some experience in certainly like being on the streets and protesting and different types of organizing. But I have not done that for my life, right? So there's people who absolutely have a much more experience with how and know how to build a campaign and how to set up a database and do outreach and organize and all of these things. And there's a huge amount of really important skill sets in that. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I've had my good friend Joshua Kahn Russell so much on TMBS from Wildfire Project. Like, that's really important that we bridge these worlds. And at the same time, I still think there is a tendency with some folks to sort of say like, hey, like, we're the organizers, or we're the Democratic Party operatives, or we're the activists, or we're this, this, and this. And it's like, okay, well, guys, yes, it's been super unfavorable terrain for the left for decades, but also like, just this isn't working. So I can't at the same time just like automatically valorize your experience, because we have to look at why we are where we are. And where we are is that there is not a real sector for power. There is not a real, and part of that is, I think, yes, totally there could have been tactical differences with Bernie Sanders. I think that, and I've said this before, I think the time horizon is already shrinking on this, but I think that if maybe there was like a meeting of people basically saying like, all right, we're going to do a petition, we're going to get several million people to sign that they will, and by the way, you would also have to say you would frankly vote for Joe Biden if these conditions are met, just to like keep it real. But if you said, and not just like vague promises, but like, okay, Nina Turner's vice president if she wants it, or, we want Sarah Nelson at Labor. We want, like, these are like, not just, by the way, like vague policy commitments, but like staffing, which is probably the most important thing. The Democratic platform, we're over that. We did that in 2016. It had some merit then. It's irrelevant now. So I think, I think that this just goes back to the idea of like sitting with where we actually are is important, because then that's going to allow us to get to someplace better. And then once we're real, I think we can say opinion has changed a lot. Bernie's accomplished a hell of a lot. There are millions of new people that are activated and engaged, and like strikes are happening and organizing is happening. We can actually start to index all these really important things, but only if we start from like the groundwork. It's like if you go to the doctor and it's like, hey, like, that's awesome, you made some strides. Like, you're cutting down smoking a little bit. That's awesome. At the same time, the vitals are still pretty bad. We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent analogy. I mean, look, consider the fact that tens of millions of Americans just lost their jobs. They've been laid off. And in most of those cases, they've also lost their health insurance in the middle of a pandemic where treatment for a lethal virus is still not covered. It's still not free. Congress totally dropped the ball on that. And the left has still really struggled to basically pressure the Joe Bidens of the world to support a single-payer healthcare system. How insane is that? And I loved what Richard Wolff had to say in one of your recent episodes. He was talking about how we have the largest labor strike. I mean, it's not labeled a labor strike because people were forced out of their jobs due to this pandemic. But what has happened is the people with power have realized that everything really does rely on labor, right? And there's a lot of power in that. And the question is, how do we use that to our advantage?
Absolutely. That is the question. And I think that is where there's real opportunity. And I think that's like the paradox of the moment. But I mean, if enough people subscribe to the Jacobin channel, which you should subscribe to right now, and also watch Matt Brunig's stay-at-home teach-in tonight on Nordic social.
I mean, you speak for yourself.
You don't think you can pull it off? I can pull it off.
Did you say a mouse suit?
Mao.
Oh, a mouse suit.
Yeah,
I'm like, I don't know where the mouse suit comes from.
No, Mao. MAO.
I'd like to see you in it first, and then I'll consider.
Okay. Let's actually start just outsourcing this. Bhaskar will do it.
Okay.
Well, we'll have our producer. Our producer Kale should be in one, and then he can like organize against us or something. I think we have David Sirota coming on in a couple of minutes. So yeah, but folks, definitely like this show is not like, it's a different model. We're not doing anything behind a paywall. This isn't like do a Patreon membership, whatever. What you can do is hit subscribe, spread the word. I think at some point, maybe there'll be a super chat donation thing. And then, the other idea is checking out the Jacobin magazine, which is really just an incredible resource for getting context and understanding all of these things. Obviously, you see Anna every day on TYT. You see me on TMBS and Majority Report, and certainly all things in independent media that are really important to support. But this is we're doing this in a different way, and the best way to start supporting it now is watching the content and hitting subscribe and checking out the magazine.
Yeah, definitely. Let me know, Cale, when we have David on.
Actually, Cale, can we take like a 30-second, 1 minute break? Okay, we're going to take a really brief break, guys, and we will be right back with David Sirota.
Welcome back to Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. Joining us now is journalist and speechwriter and senior advisor for the Bernie Sanders campaign, David Sirota. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you guys.
So I wanted to start off by asking you about some of the teachable moments from the Sanders 2020 campaign. What would you say we can take with us moving forward as leftists who really do want to implement the policies that he championed?
Well, obviously the polls tell us that the terms of the political debate and what people want have changed dramatically in the sense of, things like Medicare for all, things like a Green New Deal. So, I'm not one of these people who says that, we won when we lost. I mean, let's be clear, we lost the election and we should go over why we lost the election. But I do think that taking the historical long view here, that Bernie Sanders as a political leader and the Bernie Sanders campaign, I think the best case scenario would be that his campaign is a campaign that helped change what's called the Overton window, or what basically moving the parameters of the debate. And if you want to look at it in historical terms, and I want to be explicitly clear about this, so it's not taken out of context to suggest that I like Ronald Reagan, just putting that out there. But the metaphor would be that there was Barry Goldwater for the right, who created and pioneered and trailblazed an ideological path that ultimately was realized by the election of Ronald Reagan. And if for progressives, Bernie Sanders plays the role of a trailblazing pioneer who then, as a Barry Goldwater figure, who then helps create the political topography for a progressive version of Ronald Reagan, that would be a significant accomplishment for him and for this movement. And I think there's a lot of things to take away from the election to suggest that is where we are in the arc of history. But again, I just want to reiterate, just for people, if they want to take me out of context and say that I'm saying that Bernie Sanders is Barry Goldwater, that's not what I'm saying. And I'm not saying I like Ronald Reagan. But the metaphor, I hope, still stands.
David's more of a George H.W. Bush guy. Yeah, I mean, I understand the need to do that, which is a whole other conversation for another day. But in order to do that, in order to follow that trajectory, and I want to just bring this into the conversation, this new report in The Intercept that Ryan Grimm did on this firm Hawkfish, which I know you're familiar with, the Bloomberg firm basically pitching its services as a vendor to the Biden campaign. And I'm curious your thoughts on that generally, but also what is the meeting point between the fact that, of course, Bernie has shown this incredible leadership, and there's also like the depressing, disgusting part, which is we're going into a Great Depression with no public health response really to a pandemic, and the need for labor organizing. There's going to be plenty of people right now that will move to some type of left because conditions are so awful. There'll be people who maybe a couple months ago they did think like, hey, I don't want some big disruption in the healthcare system. Well, they're about to lose their healthcare if they haven't already, right? Like really awful things will also set that context. But beyond the level of like ideas and ideology and overturn window and polls, what about the literal infrastructure of the Democratic Party, of like who's actually running it, what firms are getting contracted, and how does that relate to this broader effort to carry on that analogy of Goldwater to Reagan?
Well, look, I mean, obviously the Democratic Party establishment, and establishment is a word that's overused, but as we understand it, an establishment is it's not just the elected officials, it's the think tanks, it's the adjacent media organizations, it is the consulting firms, it is the lobbying firms, it is the trade associations. All that establishment clearly wants to make sure, in the words of Joe Biden, that, quote, nothing would fundamentally change even during this crisis. Now, I'm sure the argument is that and there is merit to this, that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party being in control of the executive branch would be a fundamental change from Donald Trump. And we can't deny that. That is absolutely the case. But generally speaking, for the economy, for working people's lives, the establishment is offering at best incremental change, a public option, not Medicare for all, incremental climate policies, not a Green New Deal, and the like. And that's a long way of saying that that's never going to change, that an establishment in a sense it exists to preserve the status quo, that it's established and it wants to keep it that way and preserve its power. So that's a long way of saying that the organizing that is going to have to change the trajectory of Democratic Party history and of American history is probably going to have to be done both outside of the Democratic Party, in workplaces all across this country, right? Almost outside of, in a lot of cases, the electoral political arena, and in the labor organizing space. And we've seen that, and we've seen a lot of good signs from that. So there's going to have to be that. And then there's going to have to be an effort to essentially take over or take back, whatever metaphor you want to use, the Democratic Party right now. And we've seen movements like that in the past that have been successful. And I think, again, going back to the Bernie campaign, I think the Bernie campaign, one of its legacies will be is that it has emboldened the base of the Democratic Party at the voter level. It has emboldened the activists. It has emboldened a new crop of elected officials, some of whom are at the local level, state level. Like, for instance, my wife, she's a state representative. She won her primary with the help of Bernie Sanders. And, looking out further in future years, where these elected officials go from whether they're at the city council level, the state legislature, do they move into larger positions in government and therefore in the Democratic Party? This is all an organic process. I want to be also clear that I'm not saying my wife is running for a higher office or anything like that. I'm making a larger point here. That I'll give you another example, like Ro Khanna, right? Ro Khanna was our co-chair, an elected member of Congress. where does Ro Khanna go from here in terms of, does he try to go run for a higher office? Does he have a bigger role inside the Democratic Party if he remains in the House as a more and more senior member of Congress? Ultimately, these things take time. And I think so all that's to say that the trends that we're looking at, the outside organizing, the labor activism, and the, I don't love the word infiltration, but the emboldened base of the Democratic Party, those are trends that tell us that I do think we are moving a Democratic Party in a more progressive direction. And I should add that, as you alluded to, the external factors in our economy are certainly underscoring the urgency of the policy argument being made by progressives, by labor unions, and by the progressive movement as a whole.
So, David, I actually want to follow up on that, because Michael and I had a conversation off air weeks ago about whether or not it makes sense for Bernie to stay in the race. And I made the case that it's important for him to stay in because our conditions have changed rapidly. And you're right, these conditions certainly do underscore the urgency of implementing the types of policies that Bernie Sanders has been pushing for literally for decades. And so my question is, why did he make the decision to drop out of the race rather than stay in and maybe more forcefully make the case for the very policies that all of these tens of millions of Americans who just got laid off would benefit from tremendously?
Well, I mean, I take him at his word. I mean, he essentially said that the focus on the coronavirus response has to be his first priority as a United States Senator. He also suggested that the math of winning the nomination was nearly impossible. Look, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer here, in the sense of it's a matter of opinion, it's a matter of judgment in terms of whether he should stay in or should have dropped out. I think there are good arguments on either side. I think the question now is, what kind of leverage does he have specifically, and what kind of leverage does the progressive movement have generally over the nominee? And I think I've said this to a couple of reporters, I'll say it here. Joe Biden has a big choice to make. Joe Biden can be the Joe Biden of many, many decades, in which Joe Biden made his public brand all about juxtaposing himself in opposition to, in contrast with, the base of the Democratic Party. I mean, you can find it, there's an old press release of Joe Biden on a Senate website bragging about being one of the most conservative senators in the Senate. We've seen that model. That was a big model in the past of the Democratic Party. I mean, Joe Lieberman was the most famous for it, in which politicians go into general elections, Democratic politicians saying, hey, I am not a progressive, I am not a liberal, I am not part of the supposedly radical base of my party. Look at me, I'm a moderate. It is a triangulating model. That was the dominant model of national Democratic politics for 30 plus years. The choice for Joe Biden is that his model? And I think at the last debate with Bernie Sanders, there were some disturbing signs that still is, or still may be, his model. That he was extremely combative over the issue of Medicare for all. He dug in. After the debate, his chief advisor, Anita Dunn, went out and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, what you saw was Joe Biden dispense with the kind of protester that he's dispensed with his entire life. So, a very scoffing and sneering attitude towards the base of the Democratic Party. So that's one choice that Joe Biden can make. And I think that is a destructive choice. I think that will not unify this party. It will not energize voters. It is the wrong way to go. But don't underestimate the power of that triangulating ideology and that triangulating theory of winning elections, even though it has often been an election loser. Don't underestimate the power of that. So that's one choice he can make. The other choice he can make is to actually reach out to the progressive base of the party and make real substantive policy concessions to that base, not just rhetoric, but real concessions to that base to build a broader coalition. I mean, here is the thing. For as much criticism as Bernie Sanders received for not broadening or expanding his coalition in the Democratic primary in 2020, which some of that is valid. I mean, that's in the numbers. Joe Biden didn't exactly have an incredibly broad coalition either. Now, he managed to win the primary. So that's, in his favor. But if you look at the exit polling and the demographics, Joe Biden's coalition is relatively narrow. And if he wants to expand that coalition to energize and truly unify the party, he is going to have to discard a way of thinking about politics that he himself has been a champion of for many, many decades. He and the people in his campaign, they are going to have to, if they want to unify this party, they're going to have to suck it up. They're going to have to not sneer at the base of the Democratic Party. They're going to have to not insult or denigrate the base of that party. They're going to have to offer more than just Trump is bad, that message. They're going to have to actually reach out and engage. And I'm not sure whether they're going to do that. That's the big question. In my mind, that's the big question moving into the general election.
So, David, you're talking about the base of the Democratic Party, and I'm curious about that. And because I think that obviously, and it's very clear when we look at people like Joe Biden or Bill Clinton that, yes, they built their whole careers off of saying like, hey, I'm the Democrat who will cut Social Security or Medicare or demonize people of color or attack labor. And then we look at this 2020 primary, and you would know the different, you would have more insight just because of your role, like in terms of like actually breaking down the different demographics here. But it's like, is it if we looked at like three demographics in the party, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like there's the working class coalition that is predominantly younger, that Bernie spoke to clearly and did mobilize very effectively, not enough to win, but mobilized significantly. Then there's this, not a majority, but a not insignificant part of the party that really is kind of like, and maybe part of the base. They're voting in primaries. They played a pretty big role in 2018 midterms. They really are kind of more of like suburban, don't like Trump, socially somewhat tolerant, but not economically progressive. And then is there this kind of Biden wave of, in some ways, like almost the parents, like I'll just be real explicit. My grandmother's a retired union woman in Florida, right? She literally worked at Penn Station and was able to retire well because it was a completely different time, in terms of her labor power, basically. And, she likes Bernie, but she felt more comfortable with Biden. A lot of it was electability stuff. And that it seems to me that, first of all, what exactly is the base if there's all these different sort of facets of it? The Democratic base might be more complicated than the Republican base. And secondly, do we have to really distinguish between some of the more kind of like professional class, educated types versus making a progressive message more comfortable and more palatable for basically older working class voters who maybe are more persuaded by media than younger voters, mainstream media?
I mean, that's a very astute analysis. I mean, my response to it is, one way to clarify things, and this is slightly oversimplifying things, but one way to clarify the divide in the Democratic Party is just purely generational. That you have older voters who are more ideologically conservative, but also more politically conservative, and by that I mean not necessarily as open or motivated by the prospect of far-reaching systemic change. So there's ideological conservatism, which is, essentially Republican policies, but there's also a greater hostility to just any kind of systemic change, a very status quo, a status quo preference. And look, we're speaking in broad terms here. This is, we're sort of generalizing here. But the point is that what we know in the Democratic Party is that when we look at voting preferences, Biden literally campaigned by saying nothing would fundamentally change. I mean, that is like, how much more crystal clear can you get with a promise of the status quo? And I actually believe that was in some ways appealing to a sizable segment of older voters who are nervous about systemic change as they approach retirement and their senior years. I think that's a real dynamic that we have to deal with. Now, we're living in a moment where the idea of preserving the status quo, or even going back to this mythical quote unquote normal, seems more and more mythical, more and more fantastical, more and more fraudulent. So, I mean, the argument that the progressive movement needs to be making is, one, there is no going back. And P.S., going back to the quote unquote normal, I mean, the past quote normal wasn't that great. I mean, so let's remember the financial crisis. I mean, that was not exactly our shining moment here as a nation, right? So one, we can't go back, and two, if we don't go forward with very bold policies, then we face a catastrophe. And I think that it's hard to motivate voters with doomsday projections, but we also have to be honest about it. I mean, the choice is not preserve a status quo and stay at some sort of tolerable stasis, or have a far-reaching disruptive revolution. The choice is actually between an absolute set of cataclysms, a climate cataclysm, we're going through a pandemic cataclysm. That's one choice, a feudal economy where fewer and fewer people own more and more of the wealth, and basically people can't get the basic necessities. That's one choice. Or systemic, some might say, quote, radical changes to our economy so that we can have a new normal that actually creates some stability for everyone in this country. Those are the actual two choices. It's not a safe normal versus some sort of, very disruptive revolution. It's a disruptive set of catastrophes of great human suffering versus systemic radical changes to create a new form of stability. That's the actual choice, and the progressive movement needs to be articulating it in those terms.
David, you said something that really sparked an interest, and it has to do with the older voters who might be turned off to messaging about systemic change. I think that we also need to tackle literally decades of pro-individualistic framing, right? So individualism, thinking everything is all meant, like men for themselves, like we're all looking out for ourselves, screw everyone else. People have stopped thinking about how intertwined we all are, and how important it is that that material improvements are seen across the board, regardless of which demographic you're part of. But I do want to just bring up the fact that, you talk about senior citizens, older people who are about to retire, they're thinking about their retirement, and maybe that messaging of systemic change doesn't appeal to them. Which is why I thought it was so important for the Bernie campaign to highlight Joe Biden's attempts to cut Social Security. I don't know if this is what you guys were thinking about strategically in pushing that messaging, but we all remember how the media treated the Bernie campaign for simply bringing up Joe Biden's record on Social Security. So when we talk about strategy moving forward, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how to tackle media framing, corporate media framing moving forward, because we can have the activism, we can have a movement that's well organized, but you still need media in order to accurately depict what's going on. And we simply don't have that right now. Yes, there are independent news sources that people turn to, but they just don't have the same weight, at least not yet, that corporate media does. So how do we tackle that?
It's a great question. And let me just give you a few thoughts. I mean, one, I would go a step further and say that the media environment that we operated in this campaign allowed Joe Biden to repeatedly and explicitly lie about his record. I mean, he literally lied about his record over and over and over again. And I actually was surprised that he could pull it off with a straight face. I mean, there was moments where he said he never tried to cut Social Security. I mean, it's just absurd. It's just ridiculous. But there was an important lesson in that, which is that my belief is that Joe Biden made a calculation, and his campaign made a calculation that you can now simply just straightforwardly, without any pretense, lie about basically everything in your past, and you will likely get a pass in the media. You will not be held accountable for those kinds of lies. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, some of it's ideological. You'll certainly get more of a free pass if you're an establishment politician. You'll get more of a free pass from the establishment media. But I also think Donald Trump has so normalized pathological lying that politicians of both parties now know they can simply just straight up lie. They can say the sky is not blue. They can say, I mean, when Joe Biden said he didn't even support the bankruptcy bill. I mean, talk about just a complete and total lie on like every single level. But it was a calculation that there's no accountability system to make it clear, to really scandalize not just the support for the bankruptcy bill, but to scandalize the lying itself, because Trump has so normalized and made us so numb to lying. So that to me is the biggest problem here. That it's not just the media's ideology. It's even good people in the media, even good, legacy media outlets that are trying at times to do basic fact checking or do basic accountability journalism. They are screaming into a void, a noisy space in which the truth itself is not supreme. The truth itself does not hold the credence. The facts themselves do not hold the agency that they really need to hold in a functioning democracy. So the real question is, how do you make truth matter in our politics? How do you make Joe Biden voting for Social Security actually matter in, for instance, a Democratic primary, when before you ever get to a debate on the merits of whether his positions on Social Security are moral, you can't even get to stipulate the basic facts? I mean, think about that. That was really the problem on that issue, is that you weren't so much having a debate about whether Joe Biden was right or wrong to push cuts for Social Security. I mean, I said at one point, listen, it would be a lot more honest for him to say, look, I was for cutting Social Security because I had budget concerns and I was wrong, or look, I was right, we do need to do something about Social Security. Instead, he denied and lied about the basic premise of the facts themselves. In legal terms, in court terms, the facts were not stipulated in the case. So now, even inside the Democratic Party, much less the Republican Party and Donald Trump's pathological lying, inside the Democratic Party, we have a problem now. It has bled into the Democratic Party, where facts themselves are not necessarily stipulated so that we can have an honest debate. How do we get to a politics in which we can at least stipulate the facts before we debate them, discuss them, and argue with them? And the media has certainly a significant role to play in that. I don't have a good, straightforward answer for that, but especially after this primary, right? Where I think we're entering an era where the media itself, the legacy media that covers the day-to-day of politics, actually has internalized the fact that people are numb, that the broader population may be numb to pathological lying, and therefore we're just not even going to try to report aggressively on that lying itself. It is I mean, this is we talk about misinformation and the pumping out of propaganda to change or manipulate our elections. I mean, this is the stuff, this is one level beneath that. This is the stuff that's baked in. And I don't have a great answer for that, except to say this. The people who are running in these elections, the people who are the standard bearers in these elections, the candidates themselves, the campaigns themselves, they have to be diligent, adamant, and almost obsessive about demanding that the facts themselves be front and center, that when lies happen, they call out those lies, and they must do it over and over and over again. Think about the last debate. I'll give you one example of this. The last debate, when Biden was denying that he cut Social Security, Bernie turned to him and basically was like, are you really saying that you didn't work to cut Social Security? And what was interesting about that is that Bernie was sort of depicted as being pedantic about it in the aftermath. And obviously the sort of the media coverage was a sort of a he said, she said, if you will, like a Biden said this and then Bernie said this, and we're not really going to litigate it. But the point is that in order to actually break through, it's going to have to be done over and over and over again by the candidates and the campaigns themselves and by independent media outlets. There's not going to be one silver bullet. It's basically going to have to be a war of attrition.
Yeah, I mean, Bernie was there literally having to say, like, look it up on YouTube, which was funny because that's what all of us were saying as we watched it. Mm-hmm. But my last question then, I want to actually expand out on that, and I'll bring up somebody's name, and nobody else needs to respond to that part directly. It's just a handy example to me. I always think of Joe Lockhart, who's a CNN pundit, and he does a podcast called Facts Matter, which always struck me because this guy, and I'm not trying to pick him out personally. There's tons of people like this, but he co-founded a firm called Glover Park Group and has worked with clients from Verizon to the Saudis to any number of
the NFL during the concussion scandal.
NFL during the concussion scandal. If people remember this embarrassing kick the can thing where it was going to be hip for young people to want to phase out Social Security. He's done all of that. And I don't usually do this, but I had a Twitter interaction with him once where he said something very facty, it doesn't, very something like a bastardized version of the points you just made in a much better way. And I said to him, and I don't think there's much use in really being ultra aggressive on Twitter in some ways. I mean, I am sometimes, but I didn't go at him hard. But I was just kind of dude, you don't think that the work that you have done in the PR industry for decades has set the context at which that nobody can look at facts matter with a straight face. So it's a media problem for sure, that the legacy media has not absorbed the lessons of Trump, and it is going to apply a double standard. But to me, it always struck me that out of nowhere, people are so terrified by, influence campaigns and public propaganda. Well, Americans and internationally, everybody has been sort of subjected to these things. So do we need to have a new conversation about the role of political consultants, how campaigns are run in that sense as well? Not in terms of regulating it, but just in terms of putting it on the table, that if Joe Lockhart's going to have a Facts Matter podcast, let's look at his record on fact formation for the last couple of decades.
Well, it's my view that progressive campaigns need to be run as professionally, and I say this, not in a pejorative sense, but as ruthlessly as the campaigns that are run by the other side.
Please.
And by ruthlessly, I mean, where we focus intently and intensely on the pressure points that make the opponents uncomfortable. I have said this before. I will say it again. And I didn't say it, but the famous quote is, power concedes nothing without demand. It's an overused quote, but what it really means is we all have to understand, and the politicians, the elected officials who are purporting to represent this movement need to understand that the establishment of the Democratic Party and the larger political establishment that owns this democracy will not give up power. It will not concede power. That power will have to be taken from that establishment. And the point of saying that is that that means that campaigns need to be run in ways that understand that this is a power struggle, that this is not a process in which the opponents are simply going to nicely hand over the power that they have just through nice decorum and nice etiquette. So I think we're only now moving into an era in which perhaps progressives really, the progressive movement here is what I'm referring to, really fully from top to bottom understands that. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't areas in which we can work collaboratively with people in the establishment. I think there's a lot of overlap in this election, for instance, where the progressive movement and the Democratic Party establishment actually can work together. Expanding the franchise, vote by mail, to make sure that the coronavirus situation doesn't shut down the election. Good example of that, right? It doesn't mean that the establishment always has to be the central enemy at all times on every policy. But it does mean that over the long-term future, that establishment is not just going to hand over its power, that we are actually we, the movement, and we actually the broad population that has been economically and politically disenfranchised is in a battle, a power struggle with the people who have that power. And that attitude change, change or realization should inform the way we run these campaigns so that we're not deluding ourselves into thinking that if we're just nicer, if we're just more, use more unity rhetoric, if we're have better etiquette, that all of a sudden that establishment's going to concede power. Joe Lockhart is a good example. Joe Lockhart represents the corporate establishment. That's literally in his bio, that what he does is advise corporations and CEOs. Joe Lockhart may scream about civility online or the need for decency in politics. I don't care how civil you are to a person like Joe Lockhart. I don't care how nice you are to a person like Joe Lockhart. That is a person who represents corporate power. That corporate power is not going to be handed over to us by being nice to people like Joe Lockhart. It is going to have to be taken through democratic, small d democratic processes, winning elections, organizing drives in workplaces, and building an independent media that can actually inform our democracy on the basic issues and the basic facts, regardless of whether it makes people in power uncomfortable.
That's great to know. I just want to say, because I'm relieved that some of my Elizabeth Warren tweets are not the reason why we lost. So that's helpful too.
David, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us. We really appreciate it and genuinely enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
All right.
So, Anna.
Why don't we take a quick break? Because when we come back, we're going to serve up some dessert. We're going to have our little dunking sesh, which I'm looking forward to. But I'm going to take a break first. Yes, the salt segment.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. I'm Michael Brooks, along with Anna Kasparian. Guys, we're going to get to the dessert and the salt segment, but it's the first show. So there's always, actually, you're in luck. We just forgot that we're going to do another segment before we get to the dessert. So it's just a little bit of a longer show. This is sort of like the strategy segment where we look specifically at that question. That really is one of the sort of drivers and backdrops of the show. We're not interested in, making statements and points our whole lives. We want to win. And let's just, for this one, let's just kind of reflect on that Sirota interview and I'll actually just put it out real quick without starting any, I have a lot of affection for a lot of people in the Bernie campaign. I think they clearly did a lot of things right. And I think the mistakes that I perceive they made, I've been pretty public about. I think you can kind of hear there, some of the reporting has indicated that David Sirota and Nina Turner were maybe on the side of we got to go a little harder. And I think you heard that there. And I agree. And I love his use of the word ruthless. Somebody said that I use the word ruthless because I don't understand that, the left needs to be more nice or something. And I don't agree with that.
I also don't agree with that. I think that, and I hate the reflections that are like hypercritical after the fact because, obviously, anyway, look, let me just say, David Sirota especially has been criticized pretty viciously in the corporate media as the so-called attack dog. And so I knew going into this interview that he came from the same school of thought that you and I agree with, which is Bernie needed to be a little more aggressive, right? Stop referring to Joe Biden as your friend. Joe Biden is not your friend. A person who just lies to the American people with a straight face about his destructive policies is not your friend. Okay, put that aside. What I loved about what David Sirota said in that interview was this. He said, power will have to be taken. Okay, so all of these calls to be nice, that is the effort to basically like kneecap you, right? Because they know that being pleasant, that playing along with their game means that you're not going to accomplish what you want. Look, I say this every once in a while, and I don't know why I hesitate to mention it because it's absolutely true. We overthrow democratically elected leftist leaders in other countries because of the business interests in our own country. What makes anyone think that we're going to accomplish leftist policy proposals in our own country when we topple entire governments elsewhere over leftist policies? So I'm just bringing that up because there really is a fight on our hands. And I don't say that in a violent way. I say it just to show that we do need to be well organized and we do need to be aggressive. And we shouldn't be taking advice about what our rhetoric should be from the very same people that we're going to need to fight.
Yeah, and I just want to expand on that. We actually, in a segment earlier this week on TMBS, I think we used the formulation of like brutal on institutions and nice to people. Because one of the things that's also really driven me crazy is I do think that everything from, the things that we critique, whether it's like the cancel culture or the like, again, honestly, like probably Bernie going to South Carolina and using the word revolution a lot, it probably wasn't a good call, right? And it also, like again, and this is where I will put on a mouse suit for this. It isn't even accurate. Like it's not a revolution. It's an incredible, amazing campaign package that will hugely improve people's lives, but it is not an overthrowing of the established order. It is not like, like Bernie's going to win and then all of a sudden people are going to work in farmers collectives. Like it isn't true, right? Like it's huge for real, no bullshit change. And it's awesome, but it's not a revolution. And I think there's a lot of ways in which, in terms of our rhetoric, in terms of our cultural style, in terms of a million different things, I think that we could be infinitely more appealing and infinitely more relatable to a huge swath of people, which is totally necessary to assemble a bigger coalition to win. And then on the flip side, they're actually, and and this is like the thing that was so horrible and annoying about the Warren stuff. It wasn't just that, if everybody from out of the gate was just like, hey, we've got like an actual like labor progressive who's trying to do some new type of campaign, that's Bernie. And then we've got like your Ivy League technocrat who's a little bit more liberal. And we feel more comfortable with that because that's our thing. We're into credentials and whatever. And that's Warren. And let's have that argument. And we can argue about plans and Medium posts and whatever the hell. But it was actually like several months of people saying like, oh my God, I can't. I mean, this is my hobby horse. Or like my axe to grind. I'll say it again. Like doing like a 15-minute segment on her foreign policy and people whining about that. Right. Like not, like, yeah, at a certain point, like when the impressions kick in or whatever, sure, if you like that or you don't, whatever, I get it. But there was a very long period of time where it was just like, okay, they're competing against each other. Let's talk about the differences. That was not on the table in this very weirdly controlled, policing, neurotic way. And so I think like the polls that have emerged in like the left culture of like, on one hand, this like super intense, super controlling, like super dogmatic, like we can't rethink things we say or do at any time, which is so unappealing and so ineffective. And then actually combined with, oh, well, you can't say something about Elizabeth Warren. You can't say anything mean. We're all on the same side. Let's just trash both of those tendencies like immediately.
100%. I mean, so there were two things in this primary that really frustrated me. One you just touched on, which is this inability to frankly discuss policy differences among candidates. I mean, the whole purpose of that primary election is to pick the best candidate, the person who's best suited to represent us, the voters, but also to defeat Donald Trump, right? And so it was just fascinating to me that you would hear these calls for civility in the context of frank policy discussions and debates. That is literally what the primary election is supposed to be about. And so, my biggest issue is that you would hear that argument that you can't have these debates because it's going to help Donald Trump. You'd hear it from bad faith actors. Yep. People who aren't genuinely interested in making that point. They don't actually believe that. They don't actually think that this is helping Donald Trump. It's just their way of protecting the candidate they prefer. And I think that is, it's such an incredibly cowardly way of propping up your candidate, because what you're communicating is, my candidate has these massive flaws, and rather than be bold enough to address them or defend them, he or she has decided that they want to insulate themselves from that criticism. We saw it with Biden. We certainly saw it with Warren. And now we've ended up with a and by the way, that standard is not applied to Bernie Sanders at all. I mean, every move he makes gets criticized viciously, and that's not considered helping Donald Trump, right?
Right.
But we really need to fight back against these bad faith actors who pretend like they don't know what the primary election is for, because their actions have led us to nominating who I believe is literally the weakest candidate up against Donald Trump. That's my opinion. So
I think Warren would have been weaker. I'm not going to lie, but yes, I mean, Biden is pretty, I mean, not only is Biden weak, like just look at the immediate history. Like okay, Al Gore is the safe pick in 2000. And like, actually in that context, probably actually was, but like safe pick, somehow manages to lose. I mean, with the assist of the Supreme Court. John Kerry was a safe pick, lost. And we've got plenty of criticisms of President Obama, but he wasn't the safe pick in 2008. It was not the safe pick to go up against John McCain, a young senator of color with the name Barack Hussein Obama. that was there wasn't any real policy differences, but it was a risk. It was something, and we can't deny it. I think it mattered to a lot of us when we were younger. That was like a big deal, and it was a risk, and it worked well. 2016, Hillary safe, loses. I mean, not only was she not safe, I think Bernie definitely would have won 16, but again, I think Biden would have won 16. Their version of safe is sometimes the literal only person that could lose an election.
Right. And I mean, look, I think that there are two different interpretations of safe.
Right.
So there's safe in defeating the Republican candidate, and then there's also safe for my career trajectory. Right. And so we need to be able to distinguish between those two and differentiate between them. And that makes me think of a recent interview that Jim Messina, who worked on Obama's campaign, had with Andrea Mitchell recently, where he argued that Bernie Sanders would be an absolute disaster for the election. But you need to be able to decode that, because what he's really saying as a Democratic operative is Bernie Sanders would be a disaster for my political career. Joe Biden is someone I'm deeply connected to. I worked with him closely. So he is not a disaster for this election, because he's not a disaster for my career trajectory. We need to be able to find that and be frank about that, because I think that their messaging. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, like, he knows Biden, and he represents, I think Uber is one of his clients, Airbnb. So it's like, it's people I know and like representing interests that are harmful versus someone I don't know and don't like who will try to take on my clients. Like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, if you're ready, let's move on to our SALT segment. Okay. So quick just introduction to this segment. Michael and I really did develop our friendship on this foundation of dunking on people, namely Dave Rubin. And it's evolved since then. So we decided.
It's the most constructive thing Dave's ever done with his career, though.
100%. Dave Rubin happened to be the catalyst to me moving even further to the left, which is kind of incredible. But anyway. So there are two main topics I want to bring up for our SALT segment today. The first has to do with Meghan McCain. Meghan McCain was speaking to Pete Buttigieg on a recent episode of The View, and she felt the need to bring up this whole notion of Bernie bros again. Let's take a look at what she had to say.
You're being very gracious about Senator Sanders, and I understand that. But his supporters are notoriously difficult and notoriously fickle. We were talking about earlier on in the show about how 12% of his supporters last time ended up voting for President Trump. President Trump yesterday was tweeting that the DNC has fixed this and rigged it so Bernie would lose, and he invited Bernie supporters to support him instead. His supporters are, and I think we talked about this at length when you were on the show, there were no Pete bros attacking me anytime I was critical of you. But anytime any woman goes on TV and says anything about Bernie Sanders, we are viciously and misogynistically attacked as a result. And I think there's a question of history repeating itself with the Bernie Bros supporters. You seem to have faith, because you just spoke with Senator Sanders, that his supporters will come on board to Joe Biden. But how do you think you can stop history from repeating itself in this lane?
Well, first of all, I think we have to define real progressivism not by how negative you can be on Twitter or how angry you are, but by what it is we're actually for.
You're being very...
So Pete Buttigieg, to me, when he's speaking, always seems like a little kid who's rehearsing how to be a politician in front of a mirror. Like, he just has like that bright look in his eyes and everything. But yeah, there's Meghan McCain regurgitating the whole Bernie bro narrative, even after the fact. As we all know, Bernie Sanders has dropped out of the Democratic primary. I wanted to get your thoughts first, Michael.
I mean, Meghan McCain has very limited thinking ability, so I don't really know. Like, and I also think that honestly, the serious point here is that Bernie Sanders, like, Meghan McCain's life is such that a politician on a national stage saying your trust fund might be taxed a little bit so people can get health care, who also has followers online who might say, like, hey, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. that is like gonna be her greatest like difficulty, right?
Mm.
Like outside of family stuff, whatever. I mean, I'm gonna guess that Meghan McCain going to an Ivy League college and getting this career in media, gonna guess if her dad managed an Applebee's franchise, that probably wouldn't have been how it went.
You mean she wouldn't have ended up in Columbia for journalism school if it weren't for her dad?
I'm gonna guess no. No. So I think that like the whole like, and no one ever like the Bernie Bros, like I think that is a real trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Like legit. And it's funny because you think of people like us who have way less institutional power, okay? And like whatever, there's all sorts of differences. No doubt there's a gender difference for sure. But there is also just like generically, if you're going to have any sort of public platform, people are going to be fucking assholes on social media. And it's not pleasant. Like, and I'm not saying, and I'm really sticking to like people just being assholes. I'm not talking about threats or whatever, but just people being assholes. Like, absolutely part of the game. And she's just ain't there for it.
Yeah, you frame that in a way that I hadn't thought of before, because you're right. I mean, if you're a public figure, unfortunately, it's just it comes with the package. You have to deal with some level of harassment online, and I've dealt with all sorts of viciousness and developed a pretty thick skin as a result of that. But I also know what it's like to have significant issues in my personal life, right? Like I grew up in a situation where my father was a welder and his job was shipped abroad. And there was a period of time in my childhood where we were poor and we didn't know if we were going to be able to have dinner on the table that night. Those kinds of experiences, I think, do give you some perspective on life and what's worth getting upset about, what's worth, and don't get me wrong, I do every once in a while feel overwhelmed, and like that one Twitter comment that's vicious will kind of take me over the edge. But I also know that when Tulsi Gabbard supporters come for me on Twitter, right, that is not something that like I need to complain about, whine about, cry about all day, every day, and use it as literally the only thing to try to destroy Tulsi Gabbard's candidacy. Tulsi Gabbard had a lot of policies and votes in her record that could easily be brought up if I want to destroy her candidacy. But her fans or supporters coming after me is not a reflection of her. Right. And it's just not the way that Meghan McCain treats it when it comes to Bernie Sanders. And you're right. She treats it as if it's like the most traumatic thing in the world to deal with so-called Bernie bros. Like I never knew that emojis can get to someone's emotions as much as they have in this election.
I mean, that's the other thing too, right? Like Elizabeth Warren is basically Meghan McCain'd it the last couple of months, and she's a national 100%. Political leader. She's not just some like, some silly heel on The View who got there because she was born to the right family. Like Elizabeth Warren's a serious national political leader who literally, like, no one doubts for a second Bernie would have endorsed her if it was the other way around. And basically it was just like, in the midst of all of this, I'll pretty much just complain about snake emojis. So there is like actually a wild narcissism at work in media and politics for sure.
Oh, you're 100% right. And I will say, and I don't speak for all women, so I'm just going to speak for myself here and what inspires me when I see women in leadership roles. When I see a smart, strong woman in a leadership role, I might not agree with everything that she's proposing, right? But I respect the fact that she's a woman in this space that hasn't typically been very friendly to women. And that representation does matter. It is inspiring for a lot of people. But I will say that it was deeply disappointing and embarrassing when she pivoted to this bad faith argument, this dishonest argument about how she's a victim because of a statement that Bernie Sanders allegedly said in a private conversation. She provided no evidence of that. She didn't even provide a direct quote of him allegedly telling her that a woman can't win for president. And so for me, that represented a a way of making women appear weak, and it turned me off quite a bit, right? Like, we need women who position women as strong, as warriors, as fighters, as leaders, as people who can get it done. And what she did in moving in the direction of making herself out to be some sort of victim was portray women as weak. And it turned me off, to say the least.
What do you think of, well, to paraphrase Whitney Houston, Anna may be every woman, but she does not speak for all of them. But sorry, I'm stupid. What do you think, though, about like that kind of like pop feminist discourse, though, of like I think it's like, okay, the more interesting thing in some ways would be like, you know, like, and it, you know, everybody can be strong, everybody can be weak at different moments, whatever. But there was this like very interesting contradiction that you even saw with Clinton, and then it was taken to this whole other level with Warren of like, on one hand, let's do this like total like I'm a boss, blah, 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 in a way that was almost like a caricature at times, particularly with Hillary Clinton, of like almost like 1960s like masculine whatever. Like it's just like all I do is kick ass and blah, blah, blah. Right. And then on the other hand, like, oh, okay, I am like the most ruthless bad boss ever, but Bernie debated me and I can't deal with it. And then, you know, Warren took it like to the whole next, like everything is, you know, I'm the boss, I have the plan, I have the, oh, there was a snake emoji. So there was like this weakening, but then there was also this like interesting, like I think of like overseas, like a leader like Christina de Kirchner, who's controversial. I happen to admire her or whatever. And it's just interesting, like she's very much like she's the first woman president of Argentina, or I think she's incredibly powerful and I mean, honestly, like glamorous figure. And she doesn't back down for a second, but she also has not built, like her brand has nothing to do with either all I do is boss or I'm a perpetual victim at the same time. And it does seem like there is a weird way that that's been generated in like the Democratic Party around Clinton and Warren.
Yeah, and you really can't have it both ways. Look, personal branding has a lot to do with politics, unfortunately. Like I will say, I despise branding conversations. As someone who's been told multiple times by like, you know, people who have wanted to represent me and all that stuff, like, what is your brand? And it's like, I just want to talk about the news. Like, anyway. But in terms of political branding, as a woman, you can't present yourself as someone who's like this strong warrior and then turn around and say that you're against a candidate who's proposing policies that you claim you support. And the only reason why you're against that person is because that person's supporters sent you emojis that offended you. Like, what kind of strong woman would complain about something like that, especially as a public figure who has willingly put herself in this incredibly toxic political climate, right? With Donald Trump involved, with the kind of rhetoric we see on social media. She knew what she was getting herself into, Warren did. And so it was really disappointing to see her pivot in this direction of victimhood when she's not a victim. And I get it. People are very mean online, but you have to show leadership and you have to show that you're bigger than that. And she unfortunately didn't. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, do we want to get to this guy next week? The second piece of fault?
Yeah, let's do that. We went a little long today.
Yeah, we went a little long today, but we'll always be probably somewhere in this ballpark. Guys, frankly, we did the first show and it was a tremendous success and everyone says so.
Everyone. It was very strong. It was a very strong show.
Tremendous. I was like, does Elizabeth Warren think like, and like, yeah, like, I'm not going to campaign against Donald Trump until he does an emotional intelligence training. Like all of this like nonsense and like control freakery and like cry bullying can only work in the Democratic primary. It's never going to work in the real world. And it shouldn't work in the Democratic primary either. But anyways, Anna, I think this is so awesome. I'm so glad we started this. We're going to be back next Saturday, obviously. We came out and And we put a lot of points on the board, frankly.
We did. And special thanks to Kale, who's helping the show run as we speak. Thank you, Kale.
Thanks a million, Kale. Thanks to everybody at the Jacobin. Thanks to everybody watching. Hit subscribe. Let people know tonight at 6 o'clock, there's a stay at home with Matt Brunig. If you haven't yet, watch yesterday's panel that I moderated with Adolph Reed, Cedric Johnson, and Willie Leggett on the myth of the uniform black vote and Bernie Sanders. Really, really important stuff there. Spread the word, and we will be back next Saturday. Take care, everybody.
Bye.